I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, a cousin in San Francisco who was the chief therapist for the gay and lesbian community wrote a book.
Well, that's awesome.
About his experiences, all of which involved alternate gender couples. It didn't sell very well.
We, when I was on the civil rights trip that Shalom took, we went to the AIDS quilt, which is centered in Atlanta. Also amazing stories there. So we're going to start on Gemara, but we had an awesome weekend with Noah and Santa teaching us. So, Dee, you asked, can we get a glossary of some kind? This is going to be the first stage.
Okay.
You're going to be unhappy because the words are small, but it's sort of the best I can do for now.
That's fine. I have
You
my
brought your
magnifying
glass? Amazing. So here what we'll do is, this will be for you and Dee. Here you go. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about what this is, and then I'm going to tell you that I'm going to work on something else that will be even better.
Definitely petite.
There are no vowels.
Well, the Gemara normally doesn't have vowels either. This one does. We're lucky in that regard. So a traditional Talmud, as we understand it today, is called the Vilna Shas, the Vilna Talmud. That was set in around, 1600s-ish, with the printing press. And before then, Talmuds were handwritten, written over and over again, which is why you get lots of different versions.
There were printed versions before that, but
right.
They weren't laid out in kind of what's now the standard page.
Right. So there was some printing, but the standard printing where you have stuff on the outside and the Mishnah and Gemara on the inside is relatively new in Jewish terms. What it also means is that there were no vowels. And so the Talmud normally doesn't have vowels. We're lucky that Koren and the Steinsaltz came together, Steinsaltz had already done it, and put vowels in, which is amazing.
Will your final copy of this have vowels?
I don't know yet. We're
We're
doing one stage at a time. You're going to have to put dots on everything.
But I can't see the dots.
That's okay. So what this actually is, this yeshiva no longer exists, but this yeshiva used to give out these bookmarks. These giant bookmarks, and they look like this. And so this is how it's organized. This side is it's all alphabetical. And it starts with Aleph, going in the Hebrew right to left, starting here. Which is why it looks sort of funky.
So
you may want to fold it in half.
Okay. By the way, when you Xerox, you can always Xerox enlarge it.
I can. I didn't have a chance to do it this morning. Maybe I will.
Dee, now you're
There's
getting...
no room. There isn't enough room.
We'd make a couple of pages.
No,
We turned it into a
it's
couple of
a
pages.
couple of pages or
So
two.
I wanted to show this to you so that you would have access to your own library. I emailed this to you so you can see it over a digital version.
Okay.
So if you wanted to pull it up and zoom in with your phone or your computer, you can. But I'm going to work on something. A little Beshalom, Derech, Talmud, glossary guide. But this is the beginning. Exactly.
You already have the glossaries here. So
Exactly.
You just take it out.
Exactly. So this has a whole lot more than I usually point out. But now you have it.
You could publish it and make a book.
Maybe I will. There are quite a few of those. Maybe what I'll do is another week is I'll do a little show and tell, and I'll show you all the different tools that are useful in Talmud study. There is a organization called Svara that does a Talmud camp. It's called Queer Talmud Camp, and it's a LGBTQ space. And I was thinking maybe we'll do our own Beshalom Talmud camp, maybe during the winter when people might have some free time. But we'll talk about that another time. We're going to learn Gemara today. So I wanted to give this to you so that you would have this keyword list at your leisure. Yeah. Thank you, Dee, for thinking of it. Okay. So you should have your packets open. You should be looking at pages 285 and briefly 284, which might be the previous packet, so you don't have that. So 285.
Some of us have it.
Some of it have it, but I'm just going to review it because we're not going to read it together. Which is the question is being asked. Does anyone remember what the question being asked was? No. It's already been a week. Can't remember anything.
I'm not sure we remembered the question
Right.
while we were
learning it,
last
right.
week.
So
Okay.
working with the gray time, the gray space in
Nice.
between.
So, right around that. So the question was,
Right now,
I'm going to read it. Apropos to the discussion of extending the Jubilee year, so we were talking about the Jubilee year and sort of how it does or does not get extended, right? So we said the Jubilee year is a year, full stop. It doesn't continue until Yom Kippur, right, of the 51st year. So we were in that conversation because the Gemara is associative. It asks, so where do we derive that there is a principle that one can extend sanctified time period by adding from the profane, which is not my favorite translation for the word, to holy, to sacred on both ends. Right? So instead of profane, I like the idea of normal. Like normal week time. Today's a Monday, it's a normal day. Shabbat, holy. Right? And so we have the example, which we talked about before, which is you can start Shabbat early. And you can do Havdalah late, right? Shabbat can continue late. So that's the example for a principle that you can do that.
And in fact, the norm is to extend Shabbat on both ends, right? Because Shabbat would be from sundown to sundown, but we light candles a little bit before, and we wait until after.
The thing that we already take for granted, right, is based in this principle that we have to prove.
Before we take it for granted. Now, once you light Shabbat candles,
It's Shabbat.
let's suppose you light them a half an hour before it's formally Shabbat. So is it a custom to start observing Shabbat at that time, or is it a requirement?
So there's a couple of answers, and I don't want to get too deep in Shabbat ritual right now,
Well,
but
maybe you've given me a good enough
the short answer is this, which is it's sort of based on intentionality. So even if you don't light candles, Shabbat still starts, right? The lighting of candles, which we do in advance, is about setting our own intention and saying a blessing. So you may say, I'm going to light this candle, but I'm not going to say the blessing until right before Shabbat starts, or until after Shabbat starts, right? Because you can't light candles once Shabbat has started. So you could light candles and intentionally say, now I'm starting Shabbat, even if I haven't said the blessing. Right? All of those things would initiate Shabbat. So it's really based on intentionality. Then when Shabbat starts, it starts, and there's nothing you can do about it.
So
Is-
if
Your
I,
intention.
There's different interpretations to that.
Al-
When you light the candles, the woman, Shabbos begins for her. But the man can still walk off, do whatever he wants till Shabbos actually begins.
So let's be clear, even though the tradition sort of pushes us in the desire that this is our quote-unquote women's mitzvah, it's not. It's for everybody. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it depends on intentionality, which is your point, which is if I'm lighting candles and my intention is to start Shabbat, that doesn't mean that the other person has the same intention, right?
Yeah.
Which is effectively what you're saying.
if you say the blessing right after lighting the candles,
Right, you would say the blessing. Your intention by saying the blessing is to start Shabbat.
It's incumbent upon the person who's lighting the candles.
Right.
But the other person who's living in the same house does not have to begin to observe Shabbos at that point.
Correct.
Is there
It's an intentionality question. That's the answer. It's about intentionality.
any specific thing that says you can't start it too early? Like suppose I want to make Shabbat Thursday night and forget about going to work Friday.
You know, I do think so.
They've
I
got
don't
to-
remember.
You can
Well,
start
like a
Shabbos
specific-
at 1 o'clock
Because-
in the afternoon.
So you have to make Havdalah
Right,
by
because-
Tuesday.
right.
Because you need more time after Havdalah before the next Shabbat starts. So I suspect the same principle applies, that you need more time before you light candles, right? Because otherwise,
Shabbat.
you could simply,
Make
all the
the
time
whole-
would be Shabbat, and then it's not special.
Sorry, I can't go to work anymore. It's Shabbos.
Well, what
You
do
can
they do
light
in
candles at 1
Alaska?
o'clock in the
So
afternoon.
Alaska
is
is
the
a
earliest.
different issue because Alaska has to do with how long the days are, and the tradition for communities that are in such high or such northern or southern positions, whether they would lose daytime or nighttime, is that they use the closest Jewish communities' times.
So what did they do in
But there were no Jews in Alaska at the time of the Gemara.
What do they do in
Are
St.
you sure?
Petersburg, which is really
It's the
high up?
it's the same
thing
it's the
as
same answer.
Alaska.
It's the same answer, which is
Well-
you choose the closest community that has day and night.
Did they do that?
Well, there
Because
weren't
they-
communities
they were
that
little-
far
They were
north.
little communities which did not communicate, like we do today.
Yeah, I understand your point. I don't know.
The problem with that though is yes, there's you're far enough north that you don't have day and night at all, but there's also northern communities where you might have 5 hours of daylight in the winter, and so it's from sun rises at 10 a.m. and sets at 3 p.m.
Everyone comes to shul for
Right.
Kabbalah Shabbat and they
And then
leave
it's
at
over.
Havdalah, and it's all.
Let me
Well, no,
take
the
a
point,
crack.
the point is that
Let me
that
take a crack at
may not-
answering this question. So I'm old enough to remember when the first Jew was launched into orbit and the discussion that followed. And I'll leave it at that.
So let's pause that conversation because I don't want to get too deep into Shabbat, even though we did. The point was, the question that we're endeavoring to answer is, we have this principle. We've just sort of been talking about it. How do we add or subtract? What does it mean for us to create, expand the barriers of what would presumably be sacred time as established by the movement of the planets and stars or whatever, to actually change that status? Right? This is a pretty major question here, right? If Shabbat starts at sunset and ends with at nighttime, what power do I have to then extend that? That's the question they're asking here.
Well, it's a voluntary thing. You were voluntarily doing it, whereas when you were saying with adding the 10 days onto the year, that's going to be codified in law.
Right.
So therefore, you're talking about two different things.
So they are taking the presumption that the sabbatical year, the Jubilee year, is sacred time. It's named in the Torah. For them, the rabbis, they're seeing it as sacred time. And so this, for them, is an analogy. We may not see it that way. I understand it doesn't quite feel exactly the same. I think you're right. For us, it doesn't. But for them, they're making an analogy. And I think for us, to understand how we even get to the principle before we can get to the analogy.
Right. Well, I think, to back up even, why do we need this discussion? Right? Because there is a principle in Torah that says you don't deviate to the right or to the left from the law. Right? That you don't be more lenient than the law says, and you don't be more stringent.
Where is that law? Principle.
I believe it's in Parshat Shoftim.
Okay.
And the idea in that context is that when the judge gives a ruling, that's the ruling, right? And so the question is legit. If we're told Shabbat is sundown to sundown, and we have this principle that says we don't be more or less stringent, well, how do we then know that we are allowed to extend the sacred time? Hence the question. That it's not simply the rabbis going through a rhetorical exercise. It's saying, well, if we're not supposed to be more stringent, then how do we know we are permitted to?
Is that Parsha Mishnah or?
No, that's Torah.
Oh.
Parshat Shoftim is Deuteronomy.
So
It's
coming soon.
That raises a whole bunch of questions, including how did chicken become glut?
Well, okay, I'm going to stop that right there. We're definitely not going down that rabbit hole.
But this is how Talmud is written.
100% you're right. Right now we're learning it, not writing it. Okay, so let's make some movement here. So we asked the question: where do we even get this principle of adding to sacred time? Right, that's the question, and we start off where Rabbi Akiva makes an argument where he says, we have this verse that says, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest. Right? Rabbi Akiva says this verse from Exodus is extraneous because we have a verse from Leviticus that says, but in the seventh year, but in the seventh year shall be a Shabbat for solemn rest for the land, a Shabbat for the Lord, where you shall neither sow your field nor prune your vineyard. And so we have this, it's not here, it's on the previous page that you don't have right now. Rabbi Akiva says, we have this verse we might think that it is teaching us about what we're allowed to do in the sabbat, these actions around the sabbatical year. And he says, no, what it teaches us is not what we can do during the sabbatical year, but plowing in advance of the sabbatical year and harvesting after the sabbatical year, which would sort of follow this balance around adding sacred time, right? Where we have the sabbatical year, we're not allowed to do things before, we're not allowed to do things after, which have sort of expanded the boundaries. Okay. Now, on page 285 at the top, we have Rabbi Yishmael's response. Rabbi Yishmael doesn't agree. He says, I don't use that verse for the way that Rabbi Akiva uses that verse. He says, plowing is something that is prohibited during. I'm going to actually just read it inside because I don't want to say it wrong. He interprets it according to, I'm in the 5th line now, the simple meaning of the verse as referring to their prohibition against performing labor on Shabbat. Right? So, because it says, in plowing and in harvest you shall rest. The reason that the verse mentions these two particular forms of labor is that just as the type of plowing that is prohibited during the sabbatical year is otherwise a voluntary act, meaning to say that plowing is never required by the Torah, meaning to say, right, that you have a field, you might need to plow it, but the Torah is not obligating you to plow it. So too, harvesting that is prohibited during the year is only voluntary harvesting, meaning to say you might need to do it for your field, but the Torah is not obligating you to harvest your field, right? Because you might be a merchant. If Torah was going to obligate you, you would need to own land and farm it. You could literally never do another job because you would be obligated to have a field and fulfill that mitzvah. But the Torah doesn't do that, except to exclude the harvesting of the Omer from the prohibition, because that is a mitzvah. Meaning to say, we as a people are obligated to the Omer, to the harvesting of the barley. Everybody with me so far? This is reviewing what we did last week.
No, go over that.
No, okay.
The-
The last part with Rabbi Yishmael.
Can you
Okay.
eat the Omer?
I'm sorry?
Are you allowed to eat Omer?
Barley, not the stuff that would be offered to the temple, right? Because that would be in the temple context. Okay, so we have a verse that Rabbi Akiva is teaching, and Rabbi Akiva is learning about the expansion of the boundaries of sacred time, right? That's how Rabbi Akiva understands it. We have this verse, it says plowing and harvesting, and what it means to Rabbi Akiva is plowing before the sabbatical year and harvesting after it is part of sacred time. We're prohibited to do it. You with me?
Yeah.
Okay. Rabbi Yishmael does not buy it. He doesn't see it that way. He says that that verse doesn't mean that. He has a different use for that verse, because there's a principle about rabbis and verses. Do people remember what it is?
You can't use the same verse twice.
Exactly. So Rabbi Yishmael says, I don't need that verse for this. I use it for something else. And what Rabbi Yishmael uses it for, what he's saying is, when it says, plowing and harvesting you shall rest, he's saying that the type of plowing that is prohibited during the sabbatical year, is prohibited on Shabbat, is also prohibited on the sabbatical year. That's all. And the type of action he's talking about is a voluntary one. Meaning to say, I'm a free person. I can do whatever I want with the field. I could decide never to plow it. I could. It's voluntary.
But that's not realistic if you're a farmer.
For sure. But we're talking about whether or not the Torah obligates you. That's what it means by voluntary. For the Torah, it's voluntary, right? What would be another voluntary thing that Jews do, right? The Torah does not obligate us to make matzo ball soup. No, it's not Pesach without my matzo ball soup, for sure. Feels obligatory. But it's voluntary, right? Torah didn't command me to have matzo ball soup. It's the same principle being applied.
So they're allowed to plow the land on the sabbatical year?
No. Just as it's prohibited on Shabbat, so too is it prohibited in the sabbatical year.
Okay.
Because it's in this category of a voluntary act.
So this is talking about grain. So
Omer.
No.
but everything we're talking about is
Everything.
grain.
No.
No, more broadly than that.
You can't-
Plowing and harvesting,
Food.
so you
whatever
can't-
it crops.
So
Yeah.
I'm thinking of fruit. There's no plowing, no harvesting. You just,
Harvesting of fruit, isn't
It's
it?
there's
but
certainly
you didn't plow.
You didn't plow
plant
it. There are other
but it's
there are
still
other
work, it's still labor to harvest.
there are wait a sec. There are still other prohibitions that do prohibit the care of those plants. It's not plowing. You're right. Plowing is specific to things where you are growing them in the land themselves, as opposed to in a tree, right, with an
Perennials
orchard,
as opposed
This
to
one's
annuals.
for you, David.
right?
If it's still on the tree, well, can I eat it while it's still on the tree? The fruit.
How high is your ladder? You can.
Can you eat it if it falls? Is a better
Right.
question.
So I don't want to get too far into that because we didn't talk about it, because I want to make focused on the question that we're answering.
This
Right,
is
but-
this is important though. The omer, which
Right.
is delivered to the priests, are they allowed to eat it
During the sabbatical year or at all?
during the sabbatical year?
Yes.
Yes. And it's the only exception to
And-
this rule because it's not voluntary.
And interesting.
Right? That's what the Gemara is saying. That's what Rabbi Yishmael is saying.
Okay,
Rabbi
so-
Yishmael is saying
so-
it's not voluntary. We're obligated. The Torah tells us we have to take the omer, the barley, to the temple or to the priests.
Can you eat
So
the
is the
leftover?
omer planted? Is the omer planted by the farmer,
Or does it just go?
or is it just stuff that's left over that it grows?
I believe this is grown. If you're growing barley.
Because, right, a lot of the tithes are percentages. However, the omer is a particular measure. So you need a particular amount.
Okay, but how does this fit in?
So I don't know if this is something that every person is obligated to versus a community or Israelites as a whole. I don't know exactly how that functions. That which matters to us here, right? Which is, let's say I have a field but I don't grow barley. Am I obligated to it? I don't know. That to me is the question that comes with this. But for our purposes today, Rabbi Yishmael finds the verse that Rabbi Akiva is using about extending sacred time to not mean that. Which leaves us with a problem. Yeah.
Is
Paula.
Rabbi Akiva, is his word taken more? Is he more important than what Rabbi Ishmael says? Is he more of an authority?
At the moment, no.
Okay, because
The
I was going to say,
Gemara is-
otherwise we just go with what Rabbi Akiva says and don't
Right.
tell Rabbi Ishmael to get another job.
Right. The Gemara is, well, so it's really important that the Gemara is bringing both of their voices, right? Even if Rabbi Akiva ultimately
His
wins.
voice is a stronger voice in general, isn't it? More, it seems
It's-
like it.
So Rabbi Akiva is known for having basically studied from everyone.
Right. So he's
Right.
more of an authority.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that he might have a breadth of knowledge that maybe someone else doesn't. I don't know. But here, regardless, even if Rabbi Akiva wins, that doesn't make Rabbi Yishmael not authoritative. What it means is that Rabbi Yishmael lost the argument. That's all it means.
Yeah,
Right? He'll win the next one.
And the Gemara gives us everybody's argument.
Right, the Gemara is offering it for us for an important reason. So Rabbi Akiva's argument around expanding sacred time doesn't work for Rabbi Yishmael, which asks us the really important question, which is, how does Rabbi Yishmael get to that answer? Right? Because we need to match the answer and the source. So Rabbi Akiva uses this source from Exodus, in plowing and in harvest, you shall rest, to get to the conclusion of extending sacred time. Rabbi Yishmael uses that verse for something else. So then we're left with the question, how do we get to the extended sacred time? Right? How does Rabbi Yishmael get there?
It's in a baraita.
Right? It's always in a variety. No.
Standard answer.
Right. Is everybody with me so far?
Uh-huh.
Yeah? No? What part? What part? That last part that I said?
You mentioned a winner and loser for every Talmudic argument.
I did. Well, then I misspoke. Definitely not a winner and a loser for every argument.
For many, most.
Some.
Some. What does that mean?
It means that the majority went with them.
Okay.
That's all that means. That they are the answer for now.
It means you can pick a rabbi that you ask
It,
for.
it doesn't mean everybody.
You pick the answer that works for you.
It doesn't
And you
mean
pick the
that
rabbi that will give you the
all
answer
the
that will work for
rabbis
you.
started
It's like doctor
observing
shopping.
that way.
Correct.
No, you're not allowed to. You
Correct.
can only ask one rabbi.
So,
That's
with
the
the
rabbi's opinion.
risk of getting us very off track here, very quickly, we've really only done reviews so far today. They're the only circumstance that I can think of where they even talk about everyone agreeing is in the ruling that if a court of 70 rules everyone unanimously in a capital case, that the court is ultimately thrown out. That they have to pull a new group of 70 to run the case. That's the only circumstance I can think of where unanimity even shows up. It's never unanimous. Ever. Yeah, so that's the only case I can think of. So when winning means that either it's recorded as them winning, or that the majority or the editor of the Talmud thought that they were the answer for them. All right. So, left with the question, how does Rabbi Yishmael answer our question, which is, what's the question we're trying to answer?
Extending it.
How do we extend...
Or not extend.
Right. How do we derive it? Where do we get it from? We know where Rabbi Akiva gets it from, which is from the book of Exodus. Now we have to find out where Rabbi Yishmael gets it from. Okay, can I get a volunteer to read from the next paragraph? But before we do that, I want to highlight important Talmud words for you. So, look at the second line, fourth word. You'll see the word nafka. Does everybody see that? So let's take a look in our little guide here on the second side, about halfway down in the center column. Second side would be on the right in this case. So if you're looking at the sheet as a whole, it'll be your fifth column. And you'll look down, you'll see the word nafka, and the word nafka says
emerged or derived from,
right? Derived from is the one we're going to use. Does everybody see that? Nafka, did you see it, Joe? It's over here. So it says nafka. Now we're back in the Gemara. Nafka le mi de Tanya. Everybody see that?
Where are we?
We're in the second line in that paragraph where it says the Gemara asks on 285. Is everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
I know we're getting really into the weeds today, but that's okay. Does everybody see it? Where it says nafka. It's the fourth word on the second line of the second paragraph. And it says nafka le mi de Tanya. Nafka means it was derived from or came out of, right? Le, for him. Me, which means from. And then what does de Tanya mean? What does de Tanya mean? Tanya? Paula already said it earlier.
Baraita.
It was taught in a Baraita. Which means we have a question and we know that the answer is going to start with, we have derived it for him. It derived it for him, like it was derived for him from a Baraita. That's the power of these technical terms. Is in really just 3 words, we understand that it's being derived. It's being derived for Rabbi Yishmael in particular. It's being derived from a Baraita. We've learned all sorts of things from. That's the power of learning these words. Some of these other ones we've already seen before, like the fourth line, first word, where it says Yachol, which in this case is translated as you might have thought. Right? Now that I've given you this thing, I got to be right every single time. I can't make it up. No, I'm just kidding. And then it says the third and fourth words is Talmud Lomar. It was taught. In this case, we know when it says Talmud Lomar, where is it coming from? Does anyone remember?
The Mishnah.
You'd think, but it actually means it's coming from the Torah or the Tanakh. Right? You would think that because it says Talmud, but it actually means it's coming from the Torah. And you can see another Yachol and Talmud Lomar. Those things come together. You might have thought it was taught. And then the last thing I want to point out to you is the 6th line. It says Ha Ketzad. Does everybody see that? Ha Ketzad. Ketzad means how. So it's like, okay, you have this answer. How is it done? How is this done? What is this? How is this manifested? Everybody with me on these words, more or less? Okay. Now that's sort of our skeleton here. Can I get a volunteer to read where it says the Gemara asks in English? We're on page 9a, which is 285.
I'll start.
Go for it.
The Gemara asks, I think I read that last week, didn't I?
You might have. You know it really well now.
Yeah, I sure do. I can still see it too. The Gemara asks, if so, from where does Rabbi Ishmael derive this principle that one extends a sacred time period by adding from the profane to the sacred, both before and after?
Right, reiterating the question that we're trying to discover. Keep going.
The Gemara asks, he derives it from that which is taught in
He
a
answers.
Baraita.
The Gemara answers.
The verse states in reference to Yom Kippur, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening. One might have thought that one must begin to fast the entire day on the 9th of the month. Therefore, the verse states...
Wait, pause. Why might we think that? Let's read the verse again. And you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening.
In the evening.
So what he says, or the Gemara says, you might have thought that you have to fast on the entire 9th of the month, 9th day of the month. Right, Yom Kippur is starts in the evening and on the 10th. Right, it's the 10th on the full day.
Well,
so why might we think that?
You want to make sure you're really hungry, so you're really afflicting yourself.
Could be that, right? We want to make sure that we do
You
that.
don't
What
want to
else?
start on a full stomach.
Right, but how does this? Right, how does that answer sort of fit into our answer? Right, because we have a question about sacred time here, right? So why might we think that we were going to fast on the entire night?
Which evening?
Right, it's not clear.
Is it the evening that begins the 9th of the month, or the evening that ends the 9th of
The
Ninth
9th of the month
day.
would actually start on the
the month? Well, the day
previous
starts at
evening.
the evening.
Right. So are we talking about 9th in the late afternoon, where it would still be the 9th, or the very beginning of the day on the 9th? It's not clear.
It doesn't
You
say
might
what
have
part of
thought
the
that,
9th,
right?
yeah.
Okay. Therefore, but it's
Therefore,
not.
the verse states, in the evening.
Meaning what? Meaning what?
The evening of the 9th.
The evening of the 10th of Yom Kippur.
Right.
The
The
evening of
evening
the 10th.
transitioning from the
That's the
night.
question, right? That's the question. How are we defining evening, right? The word here is Erev is how it's here, right? Erev isn't exactly technical in the way that we wish it was, maybe. So that's why, for him, he says, therefore, it states in the evening. Meaning what? What is the answer we know it to be? He says, but it was taught in the evening. Meaning to tell us what? We might have thought that we had to fast the whole day, but what?
Starting actually in the evening. At
Right
sundown,
before the day.
right before the day is done.
Right before the 10th. Right? So we now know it's not the whole day of the night. Thank God, that would be 2 full days of fasting. Wouldn't be good for
I
anybody.
don't see the mix-up.
So-
Because in my mind, if
Yeah.
you say the evening, you're assuming it's the evening before, then why would you think that you would fast that whole day?
Because it says evening of the 9th.
The Jewish day starts
In
at
the
evening.
evening.
If it
So
says
when it
evening,
says the 9th in the evening, is that at the beginning of the day?
the beginning of the 9th or the
You would
end
call
of
that the
But when you're
beginning of the
saying
9th,
Erev,
whereas
it's
when we
Erev
say
to
the
the next
evening of
day.
the 9th, you're referring to
Right,
the
so
evening
Erev on the 9th
But there's
would be
How
the
you wanna
9th,
define-
the
That's how
evening
you
that
wanna
starts the
define
9th,
when the evening
right?
is.
Would be the evening of the 9th, yes.
Right, that starts the 9th.
Yes.
Right, except for the
That's
fact that Yom
confusion.
Kippur starts on is on the 10th.
No, but it's saying the evening of the 9th is when it begins, and it goes through the next day.
Right. So,
Because
but Yom Kippur is the 10th.
with the
So
word.
then
Okay,
we're
I see what you're saying, yeah.
you get it now?
Yeah.
Right, so then we would be stuck, right? If it starts the 9th, goes all the way through the 9th, and then the 10th, which is Yom Kippur, we're now fasting for 2 days. So you might have thought that we're actually fasting on the daytime or the whole 9th. But for him, he says, no. It says, that's why it states very clearly in the evening. Which, of course, to us, it's not clear at all. But for him, it's clear. Right? Meaning that we don't do that, because then we would be fasting for
Maybe
2
we're
full
just
days.
over-
But actually,
Overthinking
it's talks about one day, so how would you come to being 2 days?
Well,
It
right.
says,
If you start with if the 9th, if you say the 9th begins.
But
on
we're
the
talking
evening
about
before,
extending
then
sacred
it's really
time.
the evening of the end of the 8th day begins the beginning of the 9th day, and you're fasting for 2 days.
no, because
We could
it
try it and
specifically
see how it
states it's
works.
a one-day holiday,
But-
one
but-
day
but-
of
but-
fast.
Right, but the context in which we're yes, and the context in which we're talking is about extending sacred time.
Extending holidays.
Right? Not that we're necessarily going to celebrate Yom Kippur for 2 days, but we might. It says to afflict yourself. It might mean that we do that. It doesn't.
The affliction.
And that's
that
why
we're
we're
worrying
saying
about, mental
you
affliction.
might think, But the verse says.
I say I don't get you might think over here because
we would
talking
never
about
actually-
a 1 day holiday.
Wait. This
But
is
it
important.
says to
No.
begin-
So I understand what you're saying. When the Gemara says you might think, it rarely actually means you might actually think that. Meaning to say, when it says you might think, I never would have thought most of those things in my life. It's a rhetorical. It's like it's a turn of it's a straw man. It's like a turn of phrase. Okay. It's not that we would really think that, because we would never really think that we would fast for 2 days. Right?
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
But that's not usually when the Gemara says you might think, we rarely actually think that. Meaning to say, it never would have occurred to me to think that. Just like you're saying. Never would have considered that it would start a day and a half early. Right? Because that's ridiculous.
It has to be addressed because somebody's going to think about it.
Presumably,
somebody will
it's
think
really
about it.
mostly a straw man argument, which is to say, we're gonna put it up so that we can knock it down. Right? Okay.
And you could carry that farther and be starting 2 weeks in advance.
God forbid.
too.
Just a tangent on perhaps some of the confusion about
What
what
ifs.
means evening. The root arav means to mix, right? So evening is when the light and the darkness are mixing together. Hence the some of the confusion about how do you find the boundaries when it's this
It's
kind of
not-
fuzzy.
right. It's not clear at all. That's sort of it's the point. All right, let's keep going. So it says, therefore, the verse states in the evening, which to Rabbi Yishmael means, nope, not the full day of the ninth. Keep going where it says, but if it were so.
But if it were so that Yom Kippur begins in the evening, one might have thought that one need only to begin the fast from when it is dark after nightfall, when the 10th day of the month begins.
All right, let's pause. Wait. Before we get to therefore. You might have thought that it meant, okay, now we've excluded the ninth. So it says, starting in the evening. So we might say, you know what? As soon as it gets dark, that is when I'm going to start to fast. You might think that. Now, we might not think that. We have 1,800 years of history informing us, even through osmosis. Because when do we actually start the fast?
When we light the candles before we go to shul.
Right.
So
Way before the day actually starts.
And if we live further away, we're
Even-
doing all
even-
this earlier.
Even
Or
earlier.
else, sometimes we could light the you could
2
light the
hours
candles.
on that.
Right, so for example, the service Kol Nidre usually happens far before
It's dark.
Yom Kippur actually starts. Right?
not necessarily far
Okay.
before, but before.
It feels far before.
Considerably before.
Before, for certainly. So we might have thought, and I think not unreasonably, that when Yom Kippur, that when we get to this point, we might say it gets it gets dark, that's when my fast starts. But, therefore,
Therefore, the verse states, on the 9th, how so?
on the 9th, period. Right?
Mhm.
So now,
How so?
Rabbi, I want to get to the how so after, right? Now we start to get a little bit of what this looks like for us. That's why the verse states, on the 9th in the evening. Now we have a full picture, right? When we said on the 9th in the evening, we might have thought, we're talking about the 9th, mamash, the whole day of the 9th, but we know that's not the case. We might have thought it only starts when the 10th is officially on, but we know that that's too late. Therefore, for him, the verse states on the 9th to take us from not the 10th, but not the 9th, right in that middle stage. Therefore, getting us to where? Extended sacred time. Right? Because if the day starts on the 10th, we've now extended it into the 9th. Is everybody with me so far?
Mm-hmm.
Joe?
Mm-hmm.
Sort of? Okay.
Sort of.
Sort of. Finish us off.
How so? How is this to be accomplished? One begins to fast on the 9th of the month while it is still day. This teaches that one extends a sacred time period by adding at the beginning from the profane to the sacred.
So let me be very clear. When it says during the day, they mean halachic day. They don't mean late afternoon, evening. What they're saying is when it is still officially in the 9th, before the day has switched over.
But there's a Torah prohibition against extending.
Extending what?
Well, there's a general principle about not being more or less lenient. However, this is now a derivation for an example where we do extend the time. That's not being
It doesn't conflict
that's
with the
not
principle?
being more strict. That's saying this is what the law
So
says.
wait a second. So I want to be clear that while this principle is true, right, we don't know that it's always applied here, first of all. Second of all, This whole Talmudic process is about putting things that we both agree, right? That we both agree are valuable next to each other. And so this might be a conflict where we're saying, don't go to the left or the right, don't be overly stringent or lenient, and also it's valuable to extend sacred time. Those might be in conflict here.
So they may or may not be in conflict, and if I spent the rest of my life studying it, I might or I might not reach a conclusion on whether they're in conflict.
There may or may not be a conclusion to get to.
And if you want to observe Yom Kippur for 2 days, start in Hong Kong and then in Tokyo.
There you go.
Well, and actually, just Hong Kong's an interesting example because if you're in, the tropics, there's actually very little evening, right? The sun goes down and it's dark very quickly. Unlike here, where we're used to having twilight and dusk, and having kind of that mixed period of light and darkness. You don't get that in the tropics.
So Rabbi Ishmael has now added what to our conversation? What does he explain for us in answering our question?
But technically, you can extend
Which direction?
beforehand.
Beforehand. But the question we were asked to answer, or to
Before
explore,
and
is
after.
before and after. So he's done half the job. All right, let's read on. I want to point out some more Gemara words here. What I want you to do is, if you write on your notes, I want you to put a box around the word ein, which is the first word, and put a box around the third word, which is ella. This is a regular construction you will see. Ein ella. It's a really important. We still use it, and it means only. You could literally translate it as, it is not blank, rather, but that's not helpful for us. Here it means only. And so when the word li is in between, ein li ella, li means for me. So this is only for me, meaning to say, this is going to be true only in one specific case. Right? I only needed this because I needed to make this argument.
And Ella is a Hebrew word?
Yeah.
So
It's a
not-
shared word.
So it's not on in the list.
This is a Gemara, not necessarily an Aramaic word, like a Aramaic list, but I bet you it's under Ein Ella. It's not. I don't know where it is, but I promise you it's important. Okay. Ein Li Ella, and then you know here that it says Talmud Lomar, which we know is we're going to get a verse. Okay. Can I get a volunteer to read those few lines in English?
From here, I have derived only that this edition is made at the beginning of Yom Kippur. But from where do I derive that from similar editions that is made at the end of Yom Kippur?
Which is a reasonable question, right? We need to know about extending time in both directions. We've only argued one. How do we know it's true on the back end?
The first states, from the beginning to evening.
From evening to
I'm
evening.
sorry, from evening to evening, shall you rest on your Shabbat, which teaches that just as Yom Kippur is extended at the beginning, so too it is extended at the end.
Great. So what Rabbi Ishmael does, he's asked the reasonable question, or we're sort of answering the reasonable question. How do I know that this is true on the back end as well as it is on the front end? He quotes a verse from Leviticus, Mi erev ad erev, from evening to evening. And the whole verse is, from evening to evening you shall rest on your Shabbat. And for him, what is this answer for us?
That you can extend.
Right, it's true on both ends. What do you shrug? Why do you shrug?
Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't.
I don't know. I think
If you're
he did
saying
this.
from point A to point B, there's 24-hour period. I don't see how you're saying he's extended it.
When does evening start and when does evening end?
What are you
And
saying?
what's the context?
No, but if
Is
you,
the context from the beginning of one evening to the end of the other evening? Or from the beginning of one evening to the beginning of the other evening? Or something else?
I would argue, yeah.
I'm
Paul.
thinking he's doing this for a functional thing. If you want to start and extend your early time, you're doing it for whoever's preparing the meal before you go and do your fast and cleaning up. And he's giving you time at the end of it so you can set up for your breakfast. This is very functional.
Could be.
Maybe
Could
he was
be.
a feminist. I don't know, because we got stuck with it all. But
So
I would love to read Rabbi Ishmael's Feminist anytime.
since my son moved back to Pittsburgh, yeah, a lot of these basic principles, which I've never really given a whole lot of thought to, have become of some importance in my life, because the way they practice Judaism, is not exactly the same as the way I practice Judaism. And if we visit them in their house, we usually conform to what they do, but when they come to our house, it sometimes leads to discussion.
As well it should. So here let me make Rabbi Ishmael's argument, and let me tell you why I think it's sort of flimsy. The argument he's making is this: just as he has a verse that says from Erev to Erev, from evening to evening. I think the argument he's making is, just as this is true in the evening on one end, so too is this true at the evening on the other end. I actually think that's pretty flimsy. First of all, the verse talks about Shabbat, although Yom Kippur is known as Shabbat Shabbaton, so maybe there's a way you could do that. But it doesn't, to me, this isn't like a well-rounded argument.
the rule's the same. What you call evening for the beginning of it has to be.
Right. So for you, you're saying Rabbi Ishmael's argument is solid.
It is. It's
but
solid
evening
because
is before technically sundown is, so technically Shabbat.
no, you have to extend the other way to balance it, to make it balanced.
If you're saying evening is technically before sundown when you start the holiday.
Well, so it's, as Rabbi Stein said, right? It's sort of a gray area.
Yeah, it's a gray area. But I'm saying it's a little bit, technically a little bit before.
For sure.
Then if you're saying evening on the second, it's not the end of Yom Kippur.
Right, it might be going the wrong direction.
Because it's earlier.
Right, so here's the argument he's making, right? Maybe it applies from one end to the other, right? Mm-hmm. You think it's solid, maybe you don't think it's so solid. That's okay. Let's keep going, let's see how he resolves it. Here you'll see again, Ein li ella, first sentence. On the third line, you'll see Talmud lomar. It was taught in a verse. And on the fourth line, you'll see ha ketzad. How? How is this the case? Everybody see those things? Yeah. Soon enough, we're just going to open the Vilna Shas and we'll learn it in the Gemara. No, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't threaten all of you that way, I swear. Okay.
From here, I have derived only that an extension is added to Yom Kippur. From where is it derived that one must also extend Shabbat?
All right. Here's a little self-awareness.
There's the must. The
right?
must word. Must, Well,
so that must is, remember, Rabbi Steinsaltz's, right? Because it's not bold. Right? So Rabbi Ishmael has a little self-awareness here. Rabbi Ishmael has only made the argument for Yom Kippur. How do we know that this is true more broadly, like on Shabbat? Right? And you can see this word, I forgot to identify it before, but it's the last word on the previous paragraph in the first line, and it's the first word in the second line here, which is minayin. Does everybody see that? So in the paragraph that Joe just started reading, which is the last one on the page, it's the first word on the second line, which means it's a question, where is it derived? And here, I'm going to see if I can find it on this sheet so I can show it to you. It's not on here, but that's okay. All right.
The verse states, "You shall rest," which is referring to the Yom Kippur but alludes to Shabbat.
Right, that's Rabbi Steinsaltz explaining to us what Rabbi Yishmael is doing with this verse. Go on.
From where do I know that the same applies to festivals?
Okay, so here the verse says, "You shall rest, tishbetu," right? Why might something apply to Yom Kippur and be associated with Shabbat? I sort of already said it out loud before. How do we get to that jump?
It's the same evening to evening and the same sundown issues on all the holidays.
Right. That's not the answer to the question. Right. That's certainly true that we've made them similar. This is getting us one step before then. How do we know?
It's
Because
Shabbat Gadol or whatever.
right, Shabbat Shabbaton, right? It's in the name, right? We might want to easily apply this to Shabbat. Then the question is asked, well, okay, what about the ones we know are not like Shabbat, like Passover, or Sukkot, or Shmini
Different
Atzeret,
kinds of holidays.
right? How do we know? How do we know that this applies to them also?
The verse states,
Let's read it inside.
your Shabbat,
Different holiness.
Shabbat,
Shabbat Chem.
Shabbatchem, your day of rest. How so? Wherever there is a mitzvah of resting, be it Shabbat or a festival, one adds from the profane to the sacred, extending the sacred time at both ends. Well,
okay.
that's not an explanation, that's a statement.
So he says, okay, we have this phrase, you shall rest, tishbetu. We have this word, Shabbat chem. Right, what does the word Shabbat mean? Lishbot, the verb, means to rest. Right? That's what Shabbat means, the word. So he says, okay, we've applied this from Yom Kippur to Shabbat using the word tishbetu, right? You shall rest. And then he said, we asked the question, how do we know this applies to everything else? He says, anytime you are Shabbating, you're resting, this applies there too. That's his answer. Which he is then successfully, in air quotes, depends on how convinced you are, right? Said this applies before and after holiday by using the word evening to evening. He's applied this principle from Yom Kippur to Shabbat, Shabbat to the festivals.
But technically on festivals, and I forgot the term, you're allowed to cook if you do.
Right. Ochel nefesh.
Okay, there's a different term that
Erev Tashrilim.
Erev Tashrilim.
You're allowed to cook on the festival what you're going to eat on that day.
Yeah.
Erev Tashrilim comes when, for example, Shabbat comes after immediately after the festival, when you need to start cooking for Shabbat before so that you can continue your preparation.
Let's leave Erev Tavshili to the side, because I actually think that's not going to help us here.
I was going to ask where this kicks into Rosh Hashanah, because that's...
Well, you can cook on
Yeah,
Rosh
Rosh
Hashanah.
Hashanah.
No, but you're asking
But
the
it's
sacred
still-
time question, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's a great question.
You can cook on Rosh Hashanah, but you're still, if you're observing it, you're still not, you're still observing it
Right.
as a rest day to a certain extent.
So it's really
But
important that the
there's an
link.
There's an exception, okay.
Right, so I think here is really important. It says Yamim Tovim Minayin. It doesn't say Chagim, because the Chagim have to do with the 3 harvest festivals. Yamim Tovim are any holiday. So that's a funny translation here, maybe. So let's just walk through the argument one last time, and then I want us to. We're coming to a conclusion, and I want to make sure we do that. We started off the argument with Rabbi Akiva, extending sacred time. Rabbi Ishmael doesn't find that argument particularly satisfying, and so he says, no, that verse that you used is used for something else. He then says, we have this verse around Yom Kippur starting on the 9th in the evening. That is how we get to being able to extend time before. Then the question is asked, well, how do I know that this is true on the back end? He uses a verse that says, Mi erev ad erev, from evening to evening. Therefore, applying it to the back end, right? Just as this is true in one evening, this is true on the other evening, right? Again, I'm not saying you have to buy his argument, but we're just making sure. Does that make sense so far? What outline of what I said? Then the question, yeah.
Is he saying here, he's interpreting evening as not being a definite time?
Correct. He's saying, he's using these sort of saying like, the evenings of either end of the holidays, right? Without being very specific about what evening is defined as. Absolutely. Then he says, okay, I've derived this just for Yom Kippur. I'm aware. But that's why I have this word tishbetu, which applies it to Shabbat. Because tishbetu means you shall rest. Comes from the same root as the word Shabbat. Then we ask the reasonable question, how do we know this applies to all the rest of the holidays? He says, Shabbat chem, your rest days. And he does a little gymnastics here to take Shabbat chem, your Shabbat, and applies it to any time there is resting. Right? Whenever there is a mitzvah of resting, kol makom sheyesh bo shvut, anytime there is a place of resting, mosifin michol al hakodesh, or al kodesh. You can apply this extending time argument.
And have we now reached a majority opinion here?
Well, we've certainly gotten Rabbi Ishmael's opinion. So let's just be really clear, because I want to make sure we get this, right? We have a question. Rabbi Akiva offers an answer with a verse. Rabbi Ishmael doesn't use that verse that way. Now we had to get to the same conclusion through a different verse. Is everybody with me so far? So what are we left with between Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva? How does he... all right. I wish I had my whiteboard markers. I would do a drawing. So here's how we're going to do it. Watch this, right? So we have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, right? Rabbi Akiva uses X34 to mean extend.
But Rabbi
Right.
Akiva is also being specific to the sabbatical year.
That's true. That's true. Rabbi Akiva uses Exodus 34 to create extension. Is everybody with me?
Yes.
Okay. Rabbi Yishmael uses Exodus 34 not to extend it, but what does he use it for at the top of the page? Does anyone remember?
Oh, it only applies to voluntary.
Right. Plowing and harvesting is prohibited. Everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes?
Okay.
Then, what did we get? We get Rabbi Yishmael's whole series of arguments, right? I'm just, right, we'll use little arrows as the arguments. Extending. Right? So here's one box. Here's another box.
Right, and he's
Right.
establishing your general principle.
Right? Does everybody see this so far? These are the three arguments we've seen. We've seen Rabbi Akiva's argument around extension, even though it's limited to the sabbatical year. We get Rabbi Yishmael's argument that, no, I don't use that verse for that. I use it for plowing and harvesting prohibitions. Then we get his whole argument around extending. We could write down the verses, but I've run out of sheet because I wrote too big. Right? What's now missing from this sheet?
Nothing of importance.
Well, no, they've taken it from the harvesting to plow with you to resting your fields and resting for this type of labor to the resting of the holidays, and the holidays that
Right.
require the resting
Right.
have the same before and after extensions. It just follows suit.
For Rabbi Ishmael, it might. But we don't know how Rabbi Akiva gets to the plowing prohibition.
God said so.
We also don't know how Rabbi Yishmael feels about the extension of the sabbatical year.
That's true.
Because Rabbi Akiva's view is pretty stringent.
So
It all
why
comes from rest.
why is it
It's how they're
important to
interpreting the
know
word rest.
the answer to those
They're
questions?
resting
Well,
it to
so
multiple
We've
things.
already gotten enough answers to come up with a general opinion as to the methodology and what is allowable
So I don't have an answer for
in a
that.
broader context.
Yeah.
In a broader context, so we've agreed. The process says we can agree to disagree and move on.
Yes, and let's be clear about what the purpose of the Talmud is. The purpose of the Talmud is in part to teach us the thing, how rabbis think. So yes, coming to answers is nice, but it's less important. So the Gemara wants to have things as much as it can be into a bow. In this case, that will mean, because we're going to turn the page and we're going to read it, so everyone turn the page to 286, trying to figure out, I'm running a little late here, we're going to go through this last paragraph quickly, how Rabbi Akiva is going to get to this plowing and harvesting prohibition. Right? Nope, maybe not. I thought that's where he was going, but maybe not. Okay, I'm going to read this one, and maybe we'll review it next week. The Gemara asks, and Rabbi Akiva, who learns that one adds from the profane to the sacred from the verse dealing with the sabbatical year, what does he do with the verse? So I thought it was plowing and harvesting, but maybe it's not. What does he do with the verse? And you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month in the evening. So it's the same question, but right, Rabbi Yishmael uses this verse around the 9th in the evening for Yom Kippur. We don't know what Rabbi Akiva uses it for. So I was wrong about the prohibition of the plowing, but the same structure still lives. Is everybody with me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes? Yes? So we don't know what Rabbi Akiva does with this verse. The Gemara answers, he requires it for that which was taught by Chia Barav of Difti.
Another one.
Yes, a long name. As Chia Barav of Difti, meaning to say that Rabbi Akiva and Chia Barav of Difti have the same answer, which is that Rabbi Chia Barav of Difti taught in the following Baraita. The verse states, and you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month, which Rabbi Yishmael used to apply to extending it to extending sacred time earlier, is the fasting on the 9th, but isn't the fasting of Yom Kippur on the 10th of Tishrei? Rather, this verse comes to teach you, whoever eats and drinks on the 9th, thereby preparing himself or herself for the fast of the next day, the verse ascribes that person credit, as though they fasted on both the 9th and the 10th, which is sort of bonkers, right? Meaning to say...
Babkis?
What?
Did you say babkis?
No, I said it's kind of bonkers. That's what I said. Which was, Rabbi Chia Barav Difti says, I see this verse that says, you shall afflict your souls on the 9th of the month, which Rabbi Yishmael used to extend time, which we then reasonably would ask, is the fasting then on the 9th? Because this is its own Baraita. Isn't fasting only on the 10th, which is the conversation we had, right? Rather, according to these two rabbis, this verse comes to teach you, whomever eats and drinks on the 9th, and therefore not fasting, preparing themselves to fast, this verse treats them, according to these rabbis, as if they had fasted, the merit of fasting.
So we don't really have to. We've just been exonerated.
On the 9th.
Well, and in fact, right, what it's also getting at is that you have to eat on the 9th. You're supposed to eat
Right, to prepare
a
yourself.
big meal, a festive meal, to prepare for the fast.
But then you have a chazan who, from what I understand, I don't know, they stop eating much earlier
For their voice.
For their voice.
True.
So how does that fit into this?
He has a little
Great.
Still
No.
eating.
That's a great question.
Does he get extra credit for extra suffering?
Definitely doesn't work that way. Judaism does not want you to suffer. Let's pause because we've run a little late today because I got very excited, and we we got sidetracked. That's true. We'll come back to this paragraph at the end because I think it requires more of our time. But just to sort of review, we read Rabbi Akiva's argument, we read a bunch of Rabbi Yishmael's arguments, and we came back for loose ends for Rabbi Akiva. All right? Nice job learning today. We sort of were all over the place in a good way. So good learning. We'll see you next week.
I'm going to take my stuff out.